Okay guys, last video, I hope. Alright, and I want to show you how to create a user-defined function block that allows users to enter either a value or even a variable or a tag as an input to your function. The last time you created this function, which was that oscillator, all you had to do was supply an input, which is a bool, and it would give you an output. So let's create a user-defined function block. So I'm going to come into user-defined function block. I'm going to say add a new ladder program. And I'm going to build an oscillator again. And I like using the oscillator because it will demonstrate how to use the enable to enable the function, but also how I can then use variables as inputs so that the user can, when inserting this function, can supply their own input values and they're not locked into just one set of time. So I'm going to rename this function to universal oscillator. And let me open this, and I'm going to quickly build an oscillator. So I'll bring a timer in, TON, and I'm going to name this instant off time, because this will be the timer that controls how much time my signal is off. I'm going to add another timer, and I'm going to call this, oh, I forgot to name the instance. I'm going to create, notice I forgot to do this, so I just double clicked on it. I'm going to call this my on time. All right, so that's now my on time. I'm now going to add the contacts that I need. This will be the on time qubit. This will be the off time qubit. Okay, and I need the output yet for this. The output comes off of this timer, so I'll add a coil, and I'm going to say that this is my oscillator out, and I'm going to leave it as type bool because that's what it is. And then I'm going to create, instead of putting time values in here with the t hash and then a value, I'm going to use tag names or variable names. So I'm going to click in here. This is my off time. I'm going to click in, double click in, and I'm going to create an off time pre. And notice that it's a data type time. I'm not going to change that. I'm going to leave it as data type time. I'm going to say OK. I left it as data type time because when you hover your mouse over this timer, you see that the PT, the preset, is of data type time, and so is the elapsed time. The ET is also of time, but I'm not going to even bother with a tag on the ET. And then I'm going to create another variable for the preset on the on time, and I'm going to double click, and I'm going to say this is on time PRE, and I'm going to leave this at time and say OK. Now that I have the oscillator built, this oscillator is set up such that as soon as it goes onto a rung, it will start running. So that means I'm going to need to have a way to enable this oscillator when I use it in my program. So I'm going to make sure when I insert this that the enable checkbox is checked. But before I do that, I have to set my variable directions. I have to tell it what type of variable. So I'm going to open my local variables, and my oscillator out has to be a variable output. I want that to be the output from this function. And my off time preset is going to be a variable input, and my on time preset is going to be a variable input. That's going to allow the user to enter the on time and the off time of their choice. It makes it universal. All right, so that's all I really need for that. So now I'm going to add a program, a new ladder program. I'm not going to bother changing the name of it. I'm just going to double click on it. And I'm going to insert my new function. So I'm going to insert a box and say universal. There's my universal. And I'll just leave the instance as is. And I'll say, and I'm going to check the enable box. And I'll say, okay. So there's my function. Notice the enable line is now there because I told it to be there. My off time and my on time. I can literally go in there and select the time that I want. So let's say I want this to be off. I can say T hash. Let's say I want 1 second off and I want a half a second on. T 500 milliseconds. My oscillator out needs a tag. It's not the enable out because that output will be on as soon as the enable goes true. So I need a tag for, or a variable for oscillator out. So I will create a variable for this, and that variable I'll call my oscillator 1. And I'm going to leave it bool. Okay. Now I can just leave it like that, or I can add a rung, and I can put a contact on this. I can assign it to my oscillator 1, and then I can put a coil on this, and let me put it to digital output 0, and I'll call this my first oscillator. I'm not very creative right now. I'll say OK. All right, so when I run this, it's going to start running immediately because the enable is right off the power rail. So let me add another contact on the enable line, and I'm going to say enable timer 1. Okay, so I'm done with this. So let's build it and see whether we have any errors. And it came up, everything's fine. Let me start my simulator. I'll turn it on. I'm going to download See, I've used this project before. Let's download it because my communication path was already set up. And as soon as this thing gets started, yes, okay. Okay, and this is running. So my simulator's here. I don't really need the simulator to be shown. So let me toggle this input on. And you should see this oscillate at a half a second on and 1 second off. And it's hard to tell because of the update refresh. But that's exactly what it's doing. So I was able to create an instruction that allows the user to input data, but you have to be aware of data types for doing this so that I could actually enter the time that I wanted. And I can now use this over and over again at different times. Actually, let's go offline. I'm going to add another timer or another universal oscillator. I'll just keep it at oscillator 2. If you notice, that time I did not turn on the enable checkbox. If you didn't notice that, I did not. And it still allowed my enable input to be on because there's no other way to enable this function because it was set up to run immediately. But now what it did was, because I did not turn on the enable out, my oscillator output is now on the rung and not the enable output. This will work exactly the same way, but now I can place my output coil on that rung, and I'll call this my second oscillator, and I need a way to enable it, and I'll call this enable timer 2. And then let's say I'm going to have my off time of, I don't know, 3 seconds, and my on time as 5 seconds. All right, I'm going to then download this. My simulator's still running. I never turned it off. We're getting there. Okay, let me close this bottom window. I now have 2 occurrences of this oscillator. Let me just see if I can't. Oh, I guess I can't. So I'm going to now turn this oscillator on. Toggle that. And now this output should be off for 3 seconds, on for 5 seconds. It might be a little easier to see that the timing is different because I don't have to update, the refresh rates are that much slower. But you know what? I can also run this oscillator, and it will run at its rate. So there is a universal oscillator whereby I can set it to do any on and off time that I want. And you can create any instruction you want, provided you assign the input variables, the data type for those variables, and the output variable or variables, and the data type that you want. So I wanted to show you that because even though you may not need this oscillator in the final project, you can use this concept of assigning input tags and output tags to what I'm going to have you do for the final project. All right, that's it. And I'll see you in Blackboard, and I'll see you in the Zoom sessions. See ya.